Hello, welcome again to RP-0 America. So we have just lifted off from the surface of the moon and we've achieved a nice little orbit, and we have a maneuver node to send us back to the surface of the Earth. Alright, and we've got it set to not exactly intersect, but get us, kind of cross the atmosphere if we get this burn just right. And it'll leave us with a little bit of delta V actually left for the main engine, which is an asterisk. It looks like it doesn't have a limit on the number of relights, which is nice. Alright, so let us execute next node. So give it powers to point us in the right direction, do some time warp. So the engine will need to be ullaged. So you can see it's red here. Oh, that's such a beautiful feature. I love that. No! No! So that is a weird glitch it does sometimes. Don't know why. It tries to execute ahead of time. So let's see. Let's jump back to where we are. I want it to wait until we get about there. So let's warp until about that right time. Warp to, oh no. Well, I'm glad I didn't do that, because we are now set to intersect the surface of the moon. Bloody lovely. Alright, so let's just do a little burn in the opposite direction to make sure that we don't crash into the moon. Before that, we can come back around to where we actually need to do that burn. Sometimes MechJeb does that, and I do not know why. The MechJeb codebase is just spaghetti to me, really. Is that enough? No, let's go for just a little more. Alright, there we go. So, minimum point it'll be over 20 kilometers above the surface, and that is good enough for me. Alright, so somewhere around here we'd set up that maneuver node, so it was out, and I think down, if I recall correctly. Yeah, just to kind of adjust a little bit more into the plane of the moon around the Earth. So then I want to look from the perspective of the Earth and see what happens there. Yep, and that's sufficient to cross. So that's good. I mean, I don't want to hit the Earth in that regard. Interesting. If I actually decrease how much... Oh, it's just because the normal burn I'm doing is so huge. Yeah. There we go. That's a bit closer to what I actually need. There we go. That's a pretty good first tier. Alright, so when that burn is in about an hour and change, so I won't let MechJeb try to carry it out this time. Just kind of point myself in the right direction. We might lose some time warp time just because we might be fairly close to the moon during some part of the time before our burn. 40, 30, 20, 10, oh, there we go. This looks like our burn will be relatively close to the surface of the moon. Just point in the right direction. Here, and I can turn that back on so you can see the pretty moon. Alright, and let's light it up and just point towards node. So this is the last real burn we need to do with any main engine. So then these are the fuel cells we've been carrying along this whole time, converting the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen here into electricity to keep us running. It's kind of hidden under that service module, which is very nice. So we've got a pretty substantial acceleration during this part of the trip. Did I time warp like I wanted to? No, I didn't. I must have had... This is this weird thing that happened at some... Yeah, just make sure that's going on. At some update relatively recently, where if the mouse is hovering over a MechJeb window, your keyboard commands won't take place, which I'm sure is something I requested at some point, never really thinking about how it might negatively affect. I might have actually requested that and caused that to occur, but now I see that that does have some negative side effects. Or it could just be one of the many changes to the user interface that have happened over time. Alright, so that's close enough. So I'll be doing final corrections. Yep, and that's actually pretty good. So let's just do a little bit of RCS forwards, just a really little pulse. Actually, I want just a little more. There we go. And pulse back. I want about 55 kilometers. I'll obviously have to make some kind of correction before we get there, but there we go. So, do a quick save, and I'm going to time warp until we're heading in there. But first I just want to take one last look at the moon. and then as we head away from it. And there's still those crazy cities being rendered on the moon, which is just hilarious. All right. Goodbye, moon. And see, we're climbing up out of the moon's gravity well, and therefore we're losing orbital velocity. So, conservation of energy, gaining potential relative to the moon, and therefore losing kinetic. Goodbye. Now, I'm pretty sure I've done an EVA out far away from the moon, but let's just check. EVA report. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that would have been accomplished when we were when we did our flyby of the moon a while back with not entirely dissimilar hardware, actually, using a Gemini capsule because it's rated for sufficient time. So we're kind of flying around this part. I'm just going to time warp this slow way until we're out of the moon's embrace, till we cross out of its filthy, inaccurate liar sphere of influence. Because that is an inaccurate way to think of such things. Alright, and it looks like it'll be a little over 3 days till we head back, which is nice because we have 9 days or 8 days worth of life support. So we could have stayed on the moon for multiple days, in theory actually longer than any Apollo mission stayed on the moon. It still confuses me to some extent why they went about things the way they did. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. I don't want a maneuver node there. I want to time warp here. Because not execute. Warp to next node? I thought that was a button somewhere. Just warp to next maneuver. Will that do it? Is that technically enough to count as a maneuver? Oh, okay. It slowed me down before I smashed into the Earth brutally. So the Earth is growing large in the window after our 3 days of travel. Let's just get rid of you. So we are a little under an hour away from that closest approach, so let me just check the number. So 57 kilometers. I think that's just a little high. My memory is terrible, absolutely terrible, which is in a large part why I record these videos, so I can go back and look at the various things I do to remind myself. So I think 55 is about what I want, and so we will wait until we're a bit closer. And then we will, I'm going to set up a maneuver node, which is very handy. Oh, and I didn't actually check if I'm going to be landing on water. I sure would like to. Ooh, look, Italy. I can recognize that boot everywhere. In the ISS feed I watch at work, just as on a background screen all the time, you can always recognize Italy. So the Earth is going to rotate a little bit. So yeah, we're going to land off the Cape of Africa. Looks like Africa's going to, some parts of Africa will have a great view of us coming in. So I want to be pointed that direction. Oh man, this is a really nice shot. I'm just going to let this soak in. No impact there, so you can see quite a bit of Europe and Northern Africa. What's the, is it F11? No. 12? No. I just truly have, so quick save. I truly have no idea. There we go, F2. So it makes the display go away. I pretty much always just, I have an obsession with numbers, so I love to see the numbers as I go around. You know, I'm always curious, what's the mass of the craft at this point? What's the speed at this point? What are the orbital parameters? But sometimes having none of that context is prettier than having all of that context. Let's look at Europe. So you can see the UK up there, etc. This side up, that side north. Very, very pretty the Earth is. Alright, so it's F2 to do that, it turns out. So 14 minutes to closest approach. So I'm just going to wait another, well, okay, rather than wait, I'm going to orient the craft the way I'd like it to be, which is butt first, and I will be dumping this service module at some point. Let me just make sure I've got enough life support things and such to keep them alive. I do appear to have that. So another optimization I believe I can make in my lunar lander craft is I don't leave any of our waste behind on the moon. We don't, in theory, we don't need to bring our waste materials back from the moon. We can just, everything we generate on the way there and during our stay on the moon can just stay there. So I can add tanks to the, let's see, add tanks to that landed stage so that they don't have to expend delta V in order to bring everything back from the moon like that. So hitting the atmosphere like that. So I'm pretty sure I already did it in my last video, so I won't do this. But if you're curious what it looks like, what are the g-forces and how your velocity changes and everything during re-entry, particularly like this, where you're re-entering from lunar velocities. You watch I think the last video, like part 4 of the series where I did this without, or of the few videos ago where I did this without a crew. And I pull up the graph so you can see what peak acceleration and everything looks like. How those various variables are interchanging energy and everything. Okay, I think we're close enough now. 9 minutes, so we're oriented the way we want to be. I think that's even a decent orientation for the crew because of the way the craft is going to be tilting. All right, so let us ditch the service module. Check. So it doesn't really push itself away, and so unfortunately we get some ugly clipping here. So I'm going to set up our, we may as well just leave that bit on. I'm going to set up our staging. So we've got 2 parachutes, so that's the drogue, that is that, and I'm going to be needing the RCS on here. So I could just right click and go enable RCS, but it's so much cooler that Nathan Kell added the ability to activate the RCS through staging. So I just hit space, which, yep, turned it on. Super cool. Alright, so this service module should hopefully move away from us during that next minute. Alright, so we are about to hit the atmosphere. And this is, Africa is, man, we came down fast. So yeah, Africa is over there, and they could see us coming in, but it looks like unless people are out at the sea, they're not going to be able to see our re-entry. So that's okay. I also installed another mod. It's a cool one that I've seen in a number of other videos where it shows the particle effect during re-entry. So I think that looks neat. So hopefully that shows up correctly during this video. Alright, so we are now in the atmosphere. It should kind of pick our orientation on its own pretty soon. So the official point at which NASA and astronauts say you are experiencing interface with the atmosphere is when you're at 5% of a G, so we just crossed that, and boom, it is now rendering the ocean and clouds and everything. Alright, so re-entry begins. Ooh, something exploded. That was probably the debris from the service module. So I saw a couple of particles. Alright, so I'm going to activate descent mode, because that is going to have a serious effect here. You can see on our vertical speed. So by controlling the orientation of this craft, if you haven't seen a video of me or somebody else use this before, Apollo and Gemini have these re-entry mode where the center of mass is off center. You generate lift by controlling the orientation of your craft. And let's just get the camera out of the way of this beautiful re-entry effect. Now I think that fireball is a little crazy, a little inaccurate, but whatever. This effect looks really cool, these little bits being thrown off. Alright, so we are slowing down. We are about to cross 4 Gs of acceleration. We're still headed down deeper and deeper into the atmosphere. So we are kind of currently set to do our best to bounce off the atmosphere in this orientation. So this is not just coming off because we're approaching a periapsis, but also because we're generating lift due to our orientation. Our crew is now experiencing peak 5 Gs, and we are now about to start heading uphill. We have not bled off enough velocity. We're not below 7.6 kilometers per second, so we'd still fly way out. If you look here, see, we still have tons of energy, we'd still fly way out. So now we want to start heading downhill again. So we're going to roll to about a quarter under, and so you see that's having an impact on our vertical velocity there. So I'm going to hold us down in this thick part of the atmosphere so we can really bleed off speed at this altitude rather than bouncing up and then having to bleed it off on the second pass down. This is the way I prefer to do this, and look at how the ablator is just being decimated there. So we've now just hit the point where we're kind of terminal re-entry now. No matter what we do, we won't bounce back out into space. And we've spent already half of our ablator doing that. Alright, so let me just roll. So now we're headed downhill, and so I'd expect the g-forces to start increasing. No, it looks like it's not going to happen because we're bleeding off speed fast enough. But you know, it could if I actually, let me just roll through this lowest position. So here we're pulling ourselves down into the atmosphere, which will cause the g-forces to go up. See, obsession with numbers. I love those. Alright, so we are now headed downhill. We're going deeper and deeper into the atmosphere every second, which is causing our g-forces to rise a second time. And we are still losing a blader, but not nearly as fast as we were before, but our g-forces will continue to build. And so I'm going to switch into this orientation where we will do our best to bounce to minimize how quickly we are coming down into the atmosphere. And that will reduce to some extent how much our g-forces rise on the second pass. So I'll just use a little time warp here. And it is still kind of rolling a little bit because it's not a stable position. So we're coming up, so still 3.4 Gs, still falling and falling rapidly. So let's just try to hold this orientation as best we can, because we're still moving over 4 kilometers per second. So this is, you know, one of the many great things that makes it even possible to have a human spaceflight program. Is find these materials where this isn't a very accurate visual of it, but there'd be the shock wave at the front of your craft. When the atmosphere hits your craft, it creates kind of this stagnation area in front of your heat shield. So rather than the heat shield actually itself being what's responsible, like actually dissipating all of the heat of this, because there's a lot of energy. If you look at the mass of your craft, 2 tons, and how fast we were going, that's an immense amount of kinetic energy being bled off. So actually, because it's such a substantial shock wave in front of this blunt body shape, it separates this ionized layer of air, which is what is flowing around the craft during re-entry. And so the shock wave of ionized air heats up immensely just in front of the craft and is kind of directed around the craft in a cone, in a 3-dimensional cone. And see, look, our g-forces are still pretty high, still up there. Alright, but we are coming down very substantially in speed. If I pull up far, you can actually see it isn't a fool's errand to be reporting our speed in Mach anymore. And the atmosphere is still really thin, which is another fascinating element, right? We're still way above an altitude that regular airplanes would be flying at. And so the atmosphere is very, very thin relative to its thickness at the sea level, which is why the upper atmosphere, like 30 kilometers and way above, can kind of be used to simulate the Martian atmosphere. So if you're testing like HIADs, H-A-I-D, other deployed devices where you deploy them at supersonic speeds on Mars, or where we want to deploy them at supersonic speeds on Mars to slow down craft that we use in the future, they can test those things in the upper atmosphere of the Earth just because the air is very thin. I think the thickest air gets on Mars is something like 5% of the thickness of Earth's atmosphere, and so around this point, like 25 to 20 kilometers, Earth's atmosphere is as thick as Mars' atmosphere would be at their equivalent of sea level. They have a clever name for it, like a basis level, something like that, just because there is no sea level, but it's an interesting concept that has been defined for Mars as the mean height on Mars. So we are now sinking into the atmosphere, and really, once we're touching water, we will be down to g-forces of 1. Now, where is the sun? There's the sun. So we can see the sunlight interacting with the clouds and everything as we sink further and further into the atmosphere. And for some reason, we are seeing the ocean bottom, I think, rather than the water. Who knows if the water will even show up accurately. This is kind of one of those things that I've ignored because it been behaving weirdly in some of my last videos. And it's not worth sorting out and figuring out why, because soon enough I'll be recording videos in 1.2.2, because Realism Overhaul is getting there. Still waiting even on some prerequisites actually to be able to be releasing that. Ferrum Aerospace is there's a very it's working fairly well. Some test release, I believe, exists for it, like a pre-release or something, but it's, for example, if you want to build airplanes, you need to be able to see this voxelization of your craft in the VAB to see, okay, well, what, so far it can do analysis of your craft to be able to determine, will it fly? How well will it fly? You know, very complex aerodynamic analysis it does. And it just can't do that if it won't voxelize the stuff, and that is currently behaving poorly within FAR. Therefore, FAR has not seen a actual 1.2.2 release, because that is a very important feature for FAR, for building airplanes. So, but you know, Realism Overhaul is definitely coming together. We've had some new volunteers and new help, and we currently have a testing version we're using, which is nice, and so I have a little bit of free time where I'm not working on Realism Overhaul stuff. I can record videos like this and think about what future things I want to record. I was looking at Saturn MLVs. I might even just do a series on those. So if you don't know what Saturn MLVs are, what do I have random long stories for you? So just like there were plans that I believe I talked about in the last video, where the Apollo applications program, they're kind of brainstorming, you know, how much development time, how much money would it cost, what could we do with the hardware we have now for more impressive advanced lunar missions or space stations, and you know, what hardware would we need to develop for those things, etc. And this was also considered for rockets, right? Was they built the Saturn V, once they had them in once they had them in production, they ordered their dozen or so Saturn Vs. They still continued doing a bit of development, and they were developing improved versions, you know, things they learned about the F1 engine and the J2 engine once they were no longer just rushing to get them into their basic form, and they realized the engineers for those engines found that they could make slightly higher performing versions of the F1 engine called the F1A, and a slightly higher performing version of the J2 or the J2S, and you know, slight improvements of performance can have substantial impact. So rather than being able to say, if you built a Saturn MLV V1, which would be, if they used the F1A engines on the first stage, it can lift more mass off the pad. Therefore, you know, what kind of mass will you lift? Well, with that they would add more, they would stretch the first stage, and which would allow them to carry something like 1 million pounds more fuel, which would allow them to place, you know, many, like a dozen or a couple dozen more tons into orbit. Yeah, it looks like the water is just not going to show up for me. Well, fair enough. I'm sorry, this is one of the pretty things about landing, and it's clearly not working here. So that's just a quick example of, you know, that is one of the rockets, one of the ideas for an advanced Saturn V. If they had considered missions and ordering a second batch of Saturns, you know, what have they ordered? What could have they done with them? Was the lift capacity, what could have they used that additional capacity for? And so I'm considering, just for fun, because I like to look at them and build them, the Saturn MLV, the larger versions of the Saturn V with those more impressive engines, like the F1A, the J2S, HG3, which was an engine concept canceled, but ended up, a lot of that research ended up in the engines used for the space shuttle. Plenty of designs, including also strapping solid rockets to the Saturn V, because that's another way to increase how much payload it can place in orbit, or that it can throw towards the moon or towards Mars or towards Venus. And since I will be, my intention is to either do some more impressive stuff on the moon, as well as to throw crude payloads towards Mars or do flybys of Venus. I'm interested in larger rockets, and if I can kind of stick to this kind of alternate history where I'm using, there we go, apparently we hit the water, all right, and recover this vessel. So yeah, we're seeing an alert because we completed these contracts. So we get a bunch of cash for our crewed lunar landing, and this is the other one, science data from the surface of the moon. Awesome. And recover. So I'm considering trying to stick to historically sane rockets that NASA actually could have built, including those Saturn MLVs or a Nova. And yeah, I'll making considerations as well, because if I'm kind of sticking along this pseudo-historical timeline, you have the VAB that they used in Florida for vertical assembly. vertical assembly building, obviously. For assembling a Saturn V, building, assembling the rocket stages, testing them out, whatever, it has to be able to fit within those doors. And I think the doors, I have to look up the exact numbers, but it's about 400 feet, maybe 388 feet, something like that. And so many advanced Saturn V rockets were designed to be able to fit within those door parameters. And so I would probably try to stick within those as well for my career mission here, unless I wanted to paint the story along a different path where we didn't do that. On Venus landing. How much would they pay me to land on Venus? So we've got lunar impact. So we've got some of those recurring missions, landing on Mars. So we're mostly at the end of what missions exist in RP-0, other than science from other planets, which I'm not terrifyingly interested in, just because I like to do crude stuff. So more advanced lunar landings. So there's something we were also discussing in the Realism Overhaul IRC. Like we do want to have more missions. Like once we've now pushed out to kind of the 1969 level, where you get rewarded for landing people on the moon. So we'll see if we can do a duration mission. Like see this, it's land on the moon and stay there for 12 hours, I think. So we could also do a longer duration mission, maybe set a mission so it's put 2 people on the moon or put 3 people on the moon. And then there's kind of an entire branch where we haven't addressed yet of rover missions on the moon, which could also be designed. Just actually creating these contracts for RP-0 for using the real planets and such is a headache, and the only person I know who did it consistently was Nathan Kell, and he's currently away. So those are various missions we could be adding to RP-0 in the near future, and I'd be particularly interested in because they'd be useful for continuing my series. Doing, in particular, a longer duration mission on the moon would be the next thing I'd be interested in. Need to end low lunar orbit. There's definitely contracts I could still do here, but pushing out further than that next crude contract or so, I would need to consider actually convincing somebody else or myself looking into making new RP-0 contracts. And the next video, probably the last video that I would expect to record in this series under KSP 1.1.3, the build I'm currently working with, would be where my long ago launched craft on the Ranger 4 and the Ranger 5 are now just approaching Jupiter. That's how long it takes to get to Jupiter. Alright, so thanks for watching RP-0 America. We have successfully returned our 2 crew persons. Let's see, can perform EVAs, can plant flags. Indeed, so I will need to spend that cash in order to be able to plant flags. Well, fair enough. Boy, was that expensive. That didn't even bump them to that didn't even bump them to 2 stars. That's something we probably want to adjust in RP-0. We probably want to get to at least 2 stars. I can't imagine like what would 5 stars in RP-0 be, right? What the hell will you have to have done to earn that? Anyway, these are now the 2 most accomplished astronauts in our program. Kudos to them. Well, thanks for watching RP-0 America. Have a good day. Bye.